Black Cats Run podcast. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll, and this is Black Cats Run. Today's episode is inspired by a discussion that I have been having over the last couple days with Lachlan Earnshaw, who's a very impressive Ironman triathlete. And we had been discussing a couple of questions, and we got into the conversation enough that at his suggestion, I decided to put the ideas into a podcast episode. So on today's episode, what we're going to explore, what is MLSS, or maximum lactate steady state? How does lactate function as a component of exercise physiology? Is lactate threshold 2 even a real thing? And then how do we apply this in practice? Let's get into today's episode. Lactate, I think, continues to be something that is very much fraught with confusion, and I think a lot of the confusion is compounded by the fact that people don't necessarily know or recognize the confusion, because people talk about conflicting ideas with such a high sense of confidence and certainty, and for most of us, we're not necessarily even aware that there are questions to be asked. And if we can't ask questions because we don't know what they are, then we can't, go to the issue of, well, where do I go to find the source material and take a look at this? And so in this episode, I'm going to try to offer some perspectives on this stuff. I'm going to try to address the questions and topics that I laid out in the introduction. And I want to say again, thank you to Lachlan for bringing this up. It's really gratifying, to be honest, to see that other folks are also wondering about this same stuff, because I do think these are the important questions that we should be asking. We're moving into an increasingly informational, data dynamic. I hesitate to say data driven because I think that is a very cliche term, and I feel that from what I've seen is not that people are being data driven, but that people are being data dynamic and that they're incorporating data. But oftentimes, and as I'll discuss, I'm sure further in the episode when I get to it, but people are trying to force data to fit this. But I also would recommend that anybody who's curious, check out Lachlan Earnshaw's YouTube channel. I've watched some of it and I thought it was really well done. And I always enjoy being able to hear what other people are thinking and what other people are doing about their approach to this stuff. And I think Lachlan's definitely doing a really nice job with that. So if you go and you check out his pieces, I'm sure he'd, be glad to hear from you too. So, let's start with kind of like an overview introduction to this stuff, and then we'll sort of break down into these different components. So I think kind of like the original questions are, like, should you be doing most of your training below maximum lactate steady state? And, is there actually a lactate threshold 1 and a lactate threshold 2? And if you're not familiar with this, probably the easiest way to look at this concept is to look at a polarized training model, which tries to make the argument that there are distinction and transition zones that pivot around these thresholds. Then you see models that make further distinctions where you might have 7 zones of intensity. And then people try to essentially scale these zones and say these are different ranges of heart rates and stuff like that. I suppose I should elaborate, right? So by stuff like that, what I really mean is they might look at wattage, they might look at velocity, other metrics to try to quantify that work being done physically. And I think that when we look at this in detail, I think what we start to realize is that there's no evidence to support this. So, for the question of like, should we be doing all of our training below maximum lactate steady state? I would say that, the shortest and most direct answer to that is yes. You do want to be working in a zone of intensity that does not exceed lactate steady state. I think that the kinds of exercise practices that focus on intensities that would in some way be able to be quantified or pointed to as exceeding that steady state, I think that it almost makes sense to think of them as, and I've used to use this term when I coach cross country sometimes, but to think of them as more of like the choreography aspect of it, where you're working on things that are sort of very like specific or niche to a race or competition. And I think you do those when you do them to such a small degree compared to the overall training that I think it needs to be really conceptualized separately. And I think when you take that stuff and you act and you just sort of lump it together and you say, this is a training practice, and you're essentially saying this is in a sense, some sort of equivalent significance or weight to that. I think that's incorrect. And as an initial example, I would point to my dad's experience running at Bowdoin College and, running in high school too. But in Bowdoin College in, 1980, 1981, obviously, running on dirt tracks that were semi-rectangular, weren't necessarily banked, weren't even necessarily 200 meters, was running, sub 410 in the mile, running 816 in the 3,000 meters, and would go out and run, aerobically. And the way he describes those runs is he would go out and he'd run for, probably 60, 70 minutes. And he was trying to feel like he was making deposits in his fitness, not withdrawals. And I think that's a really great example of how you can identify these concepts of training, and people have arrived at these understandings without using lactate meters. But now that we have lactate meters, maybe it's easier to teach these concepts of training better, and B, in a lot of instances, to reteach our brains. As I've been talking about on another episode, and part 2 of that episode of how do we cue ourselves to exercise is forthcoming down the road. But I'm putting this in here in the middle because I was pretty excited about the conversation Lachlan and I were having. One of the concepts I brought up in that episode, and will continue in the second part of that topic, is just this basic cueing phenomena that when I've been with myself and other people I've tried this with, gone and to the track, just running and say, hey, run a threshold. And people do that for 10 minutes, and then they come back and we check the lactate, and it's way over what it should be. So, right, this issue of like, how do we educate ourselves? But going to an example of my dad running, which I think were very respectable track times, right, in that context, and, doing, aerobic runs and, on the road, and then would come back and do some couple 60 meter, 50 meter strides, and then he would do the races, and that was it. And I remember once in college I was sort of talking about that to some people on the team when we were doing a long run, and a couple people got so unhappy with that, and they just told me that I was I guess lying to them, that you can't run that fast unless you're doing workouts. And so, the conversation got pretty frustrated. So we ended up finishing the long run in separate parties. But anyway, so we look at this concept, right, of, how do we train? And I think that like right away, we see evidence that, working at efforts that do not exceed lactate steady state is really effective. And we're going to explore that more in this episode for sure. Second major point is that I do not agree that there is this LT2, LT1 thing. I don't think lactate threshold 2 exists, and I would say that I agree with that independently, and I also will point to that there are other people sort of asserting this, and I think there's a variety of pieces of evidence by which we can demonstrate that. But if LT2 is, and I would say in some sense, kind of like an act of illusion or an act of faith, and what's interesting about in general in sociocultural phenomena is it's difficult to try to disprove things that are substantively faith-based, because to engage something that is based on faith, like people are at the point where it's no longer the case that they necessarily need evidence. They just have a conviction there. And I think people have essentially created LT2 out of like a sense of faith or conviction on that stuff. It's like how people can find evidence for the earth to be flat. I mean, it's not actually evidence that the earth is flat, because the earth isn't flat. And I think it was Eratosthenes figured this out just by putting a post in the ground at two different points and measuring that the angle of the shadow was different at those two different points. So, and that was like, what was that, 3,000 years ago? And a very simple demonstration. And right, but people still find evidence for that. So and that's one of the complicated things, is that when people are, reach conclusions that are incorrect, they can still look like they're creating evidence, but that doesn't mean that the evidence is valid, and that becomes a challenge to look at. And I think lactate threshold 2, to my mind, certainly fits in that category. So having set this out, we can start to wade a little deeper into this stuff, and I want to share my reasoning as to why I've reached these conclusions, and then also get to like, how do we use this kind of information to optimize training. So when you look at lactate as this sort of metric or device or insight into training, and you look at from a variety of different perspectives and different sources and materials and content out there related to it, I think that you start to see that it's a very confused area. And I think one of the problems is that we have a bias that everybody, including me, has this bias, I believe, that we expect things to like make sense, right? That if there is like a policy or an idea or a concept or a theory, our sort of initial reaction is to believe it's true. I have a friend of mine, and you can say basically anything to her, and her first reaction is, wait, really? So, which I think is maybe a little bit of a stronger reaction than most people have, but for some reason our initial brain's reaction does not seem to be skepticism, it seems to be acceptance. And I think what happens is sometimes maybe even the first version of something we're exposed to that just sort of fills that empty space in our brain, and now we have something there. And so then we're sort of basically then start to weigh, and I don't think it's a conscious choice. I think it's the natural behavior, is then we start to hear subsequent things and we say, well, is this the same as what I now already know? And if the answer is no, it's not the same, then we say, okay, that must be wrong. And instead of, I think if we think about it a little bit bigger, we say, wait a minute, so this is saying this, this is saying this, this is saying this. And if it's not just like a reduced pocket concentrated around this one small alternative idea, but you're seeing a variety of different information across different levels of source material and different kinds of perspectives, I think then it's like, this is genuinely confused. So when you look at the academic literature, it is not a consistent point. And I think that we see this in a couple different ways. The first way, and I'm sure I've probably brought this up on some other episodes in the past, but we're starting to get close to 40 episodes. So that's a lot of material to try to sort through and figure out, well, where is this coming from? Or, where did I originally say that? So I think it's kind of valid to restate things, even if they've come up in the past. But when you look at this, academic literature, one thing that I feel that I see on podcasts and stuff like that is people say, well, I've got this study that shows blank. And I think it's great, to look at that stuff. And I think the scientific method is kind of the point. But I think even before we get into the issue with these studies, the scientific method isn't specifically saying that, like, if something is science, then it's correct. The scientific method came historically out of a transition from Aristotelian logic to this rationalism that we now, identify as the scientific revolution, which we can sort of say bridges across, the stereotype names, and obviously there's an issue of historical representation here. That would be a subject for, some sort of other kind of podcast. But it's still important. But, we'll use these reference points because these are commonly known, but Copernicus to Galileo to Francis Bacon and Newton, but especially we might say more so with Galileo and Bacon have this more commonly attributed to them, is this idea of like, well, if you think something is true, then you should be able to prove it. And that actually we should try to create a mindset of, natural skepticism, not hostile skepticism, natural skepticism of, oh, wow, we might say, really, that's true. Okay, I want to see that it's true. Versus like, wow, I can't believe that's true. I've been enlightened, right? Well, that's taking something on faith. And so for them, that was a process of like experimentation, that verification, right? Well, if that's true, then I should be able to demonstrate that. And if you can't demonstrate it, then it's not true. And, during the period that we sort of collaboratively call alchemical science or alchemy, people were writing things in code. So, which I guess it makes sense because you're not actually turning lead into gold. So you don't really want to put that out there because then people figure out you're wrong and you maintain that cult of mystery. But I think in the way, in some ways, we haven't actually totally moved past that. And I think, one obstacle with academic literature is that, it requires a certain level of, literacy to be able to look at it and understand what's going on. You also have to just understand the structure of these papers and how they're presented. But once you sort of master that, I think you then still see that there's some issues. And one of the big issue with exercise physiology studies is that the sampling is hugely problematic. The sampling and the scale and the comparisons. So like people are basically never doing training that's real world training. And in economics, what people would really try to study is you try to look at real world data. And I know that there's been some efforts to do that, like Stephen Seiler, and what Stephen Seiler in doing that, basically, that stuff starts to validate the conclusion that you should be doing and training below lactate threshold. Interesting, right? That the training research that looks at real world data supports that. File that away for future reference. Whereas the studies that seem to support high intensity, low volume exercise are simply usually short scale studies where I'm going to oversimplify to make the point here, but if you have somebody who sits on a couch for 6 weeks and then you have somebody who lifts dumbbells 3 times a week for 6 weeks and then you put them in a mile run, the person who does the dumbbells is probably going to do better. And then the conclusion from the experiment would be that if your hypothesis was the athlete who lifts dumbbells will perform better, will have a better performance in the mile run or something like that, then you'd say, oh, well, my hypothesis is correct, right? And then so when people are taking, right, so why does this matter? Well, so when people are taking these studies and they're saying, well, I've got this study here and I want to do a podcast episode or whatever about this study, I think that's awesome. But I think that we're not recognizing a lot of the time, like the issue of like, how is the study done? And this happens all of the time. And then we also want to recognize too, that like a lot of studies are influenced by this, like industry expectations and whatever. And, an example of that is concepts about hydration, and here in New Hampshire, it's been basically like, 100 degrees, 90% humidity for several days. And the sort of guideline for school was to drink more water. And I think it's important to drink water if you're thirsty. But there's actually no evidence that, hydration doesn't regulate body temperature. So, right, the encouragement to drink water is based on this belief that, well, if you drink water, that's going to be beneficial to body temperature. And that's not true. That's an example of stuff that was influenced by industry. And, Tim Noakes, medical doctor, professor of sports science from South Africa, proved that, quite a while ago now, really, in his book, which I think was called Waterlogged. And yet we're still seeing these guidelines perpetuate, or, sort of they make their way into culture, right? And so this is kind of one of the issues, right, with just sort of blindly saying studies show that, right? Because studies can show all kinds of things. And it was this, obviously, if you've listened to any of this podcast or look at our Instagram page, you know that there's not an anti-science, agenda here going on, but it's like actually pro-science in the sense of like, let's do what it's supposed to do, which is it's supposed to like you do this piece of research and then like you just say, okay, well, this seems to support this. So what's then the next question I should ask, right? Whereas if you do a study that supports the use of dumbbells to improve times in the mile, it doesn't mean, okay, now, high school and college runners across North America or whatever should be incorporating, intensive dumbbell training, in their pursuit of the sub 4:10 or sub 4 minute or sub 3:55 mile barrier. So another issue, though, with the academic literature that's going to create confusion is I think there's a lot of method bias where people are basically trying to rationalize their preference or faith in some different models and try to make the lactate data that you get fit that model. So, one area where this is true, I believe, is high intensity interval training, or just like, and the HIIT is, I guess, a sort of the colloquialism for the vernacular for that. But I think if you've ever been in a situation where you've been told to do, 30-second repeats at full gas, where you've done, 8 times to 400 as hard as you can, with minimal recovery, and then you're like, paralyzed the next couple of days, like that would be an example of that. I can remember, I feel like almost every year at the transition to indoor track after winter break in college, doing the first track workout, which was, might have been an example, might be doing 5 times split 500, where we would do 344, do like a 30-second recovery, then do a 200 in 28, and then take a minute jog. And honestly, it was incredible to me then, and even more so now, that I was doing that. But what was not incredible was going out and running 4:48 miles on the weekend. And at the time I didn't really understand, because it sort of seemed like, well, the training is supposed to make you good, right? But now what I recognize is that the training was my race performance was being done in the training. So people are really invested in that. And the fact that the performance data didn't support the training didn't matter. The conclusion was that the athletes were inadequate, which is not a really logical approach. And then the whole point of coaching is to get people to get faster. So it's like, who cares how much you love a training model? If the athletes aren't getting better, change the training model. But that's not always the way people seem to think based on their behavior. So I think that's a thing, right? Is to start try to interpret lactate from that, confirmation bias of I want to confirm that HIIT is beneficial. Another big one, and maybe I'm not really sure which one is more predominant. I in terms of the method bias, I tend to think that this second one is more significant, but that's VO2 max bias. And I think the big reason why the bias is here is because people think it's friggin' awesome to have a crazy VO2 max number, right? And it's and everybody wants to be the legend with the 90 something VO2 max. Because it's just like a personal best, right? It's like, well, I ran, I may not have ever won an awesome race or done an awesome time, but, I've got this incredible VO2 max. And I think in Alex Hutchinson's book, Endure, maybe there's some chapter where he talks about how, incredible it is that this guy with a VO2 max of 63, can, run at this level. And, the Hutchinson conclusion seems to be that, well, it's because he can unlock and use his brain in like this incredible X-Men like way. And give me a break. Right. The reality is that, VO2 max is kind of a fallacy. And I think Steve Magnus, who does the On Coaching podcast with John Marcus, did a really good write-up. If you search fallacy of VO2 max, Steve Magnus on his website, scienceofrunning.com, you can read into that. It's really, really informative. And I think he does a nice job sort of disassembling the issues with that. But the belief in VO2 max, and then the belief that, training should target VO2 max, well, then that also causes people to look to confirm that methodologically through their studies, right? They're trying to study that, and then they're biased because they think that's correct, and they're going to conclude that. And I think that you're allowed to have bias. It's not like there's this I had graduate school professor who claimed that it was possible to be unbiased, and I thought he was being rhetorical, like he was doing this but no, he, I guess, actually legitimately thought that was the case. And I have to say I disagree. I just don't think it is possible to not have, but you want to be aware of your bias, right? And I also think that if you have a bias where it's like, well, I've developed this bias because the evidence is supporting that, that's very different from saying that, well, I think VO2 max is the shit, and I've learned about VO2 max, and I've been engaging with VO2 max, and now, I'm looking at this research, and there's this lactate stuff, which is conflicting with my ideas about VO2 max. So, I need to force, how can I research and prove that this is the case? And telling people, well, actually, you need to work out at LT2, I think, is an example of this kind of thing. So these are some of the issues we see in the academic literature. So then we go and we say, well, where else are we seeing confusion? So the other space, and probably the space where most of us really are engaging with these ideas about training, is, in the medium of like coaches and athletes and how they talk about it. And especially from the coaching point of view, the reality is that when you look at so there's two, let's put coaches into two categories. There's like coaches that work for schools, okay, where, in that case, actually, maybe there's more of an incentive for coaches to try to do performance. But I also think like the schools don't necessarily know, the athletic department doesn't really know what should be a, minimum standard of achievement for an endurance sports coach. And even if they did, they don't really care because it's the big team sports, especially football, that are really paying the bills for these schools. And so that's really like what the athletic departments are trying to do. Certainly in the States, you're trying to maximize what the money you can get out of your football program, maybe your basketball program. You're probably not that really worried about cross country. You're not probably getting a lot of booster money or donations to the school from cross-country alumni either. Not because cross-country alumni hate their school, but there's just more people in football, and so that more alumni, right? It's just cultural thing, right? Different, not really related anymore to VO2 max. So let's circle back to this, stuff, right? So a coach in a college situation, right, might have more of an incentive to sort of say, okay, this VO2 max stuff isn't really working. Right? Or this HIIT stuff isn't really working. Athletes aren't performing. My job expectation is to achieve blank. But if we look at the fact that most people who do this stuff aren't doing it in that kind of a setting, and that's not because they're not elite or they're not good. It's just because most of us don't. If we do athletics for a long time, most of our experience is not going to be done as scholastic athletes anymore. So that means, in this case, the coaching and the training is a market, all right? And so how does a market work? Well, in a market, we look at the concept of a Nash equilibrium, which in game theory says that the optimal strategy is to be basically as close to your competition as possible. So that means that coaches are not oriented towards the athletes. The coaches are function as economic firms to generate revenue, and their goal is to make money. Right. And that's their goal. So in order to make money, how do you make money? Well, you need to get and retain clients. And so what are you competing against? The coach is competing against other coaches because the vast majority of us are not, even if we can be incredibly good, and we're not going to be at the level where we are winning the major, media recognized competitions within our endurance sport discipline. Okay. And so therefore, right, if you're not coaching that athlete, right, all that matters is retaining athletes. And I think this has encouraged coaches to create artificially complex models of training, to use contrived metrics such as like efficiency factor and stuff like that. And, I could do a whole series of episodes on the BS that has been created around this stuff. But by creating these things, it increases the perception on the part of the consumer that the coach has some sort of insight, that only the coach is capable of providing that. And, as a teacher, I think I have a mindset that, if you are presenting or providing something, that you should be able to, given enough time, really get other people to master it and understand it. I mean, if you understand it yourself, then that is evidence that other people should therefore also be capable of understanding. But I think what we really see is this Wizard of Oz, kind of phenomena, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain kind of a thing. And I think that's definitely a limiting factor to how we go about this stuff and how we think about this stuff. And, so you find that coaches are not really giving advice based on what's most effective. And I think training is simple. It's become complex because we have to engage with the milieu of kind of like craziness of conflicting, competing ideas. We have issues in academic literature. We have issues in the coaching and training market, the market for training plans and stuff like that. And we have the issue of, coaching behavior is driven towards, competing against other coaches. And so it's like, well, how do you decide between two things that you don't understand, right? And that actually gives greater leverage to the producer, right? And in this economic relationship, the coach, or the training website is the producer, right? Training Peaks has graphs that, make most people feel like they need, to go to the eye doctor to try to read them. Well, I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's designed. The complexity is somewhat, sort of intentional, and it's superfluous complexity. So, all of this combines to create a lot of cognitive dissonance. And then another factor I would point out that is making this complicated is the history of how people view lactate. That for most people, it's still identified as lactic acid. And people, no matter how competent and strong they are as performers, use this term and say, oh yeah, well, the lactic acid, that's when you really start to tie up. And for some of them, it doesn't matter really how they talk about it or what their vernacular is, because what they're doing is working for them. And that's a whole nother issue when you have people who are successful, but they don't know why they're successful. And so then they start explaining their success incorrectly, which that can happen. It's not like, it doesn't make you a bad person, right? But the ability to perform is not proportional to the ability to understand, per se. It could be, right? But you still have to learn it. Understanding is intellectual. Your PR in the mile is not proportional to comprehension of how to train. But these ideas about lactic acid, where it's a limiter on performance, or it is a toxifier, or it's a byproduct, or basically now people have sort of tried to evolve lactate and say, well, lactate is an indicator of waste, and because of the fact that lactate accumulation increases as strain increases, and then when you fail reach a failure point in exercise, it's at your highest probably going to be pretty high level of lactate a lot of the time. And so people think that sort of continues, or people then further maybe choose to see, because I don't think they need to see it this way, but people further see that as evidence of the sort of like toxifying negative effect of it. And then this leads to the empowerment of all these baseless practices around clearance of lactate, tolerance of lactate, also buffering lactate, utilization of lactate, peak lactate, blah, blah, blah. And none of these things are valid or useful training concepts, because they're all based on a false, inaccurate, untruthful, confused, whatever you want to say, but it's just wrong, and this is a reality of, talking about any ideas. Like, there's a right answer to things. And I think a lot of times we're very far away from that. And one of the things that I've tried to outline in earlier episodes in this whole podcast, this podcast as a whole, is that I think we're actually very low on the developmental process of understanding of athletics and how to train. And I think we have sometimes this sense of modernity and mastery as a culture that obfuscates our ability to recognize that actually, probably a lot of the things that we know, we think we know for sure, are going to continue to be devised on. And, Tim Noakes has a TED Talk where he says, the problem is that 50% of the things that we teach or we learn are wrong and 50% are right. And, the lifelong challenging is finding out which 50% is which. And that's why it's so important to try to be evidence-driven, to try to be method-driven, to try to be rational. And that's why, understandings in society have grown exponentially. But speaking of exponentially, this sort of stuff about lactate threshold being what it is as a indicator, and then what the implications are in terms of training practices, I think has actually ironically led to an oversimplification. And I say it's ironic because it's actually very confusing. So to from all of a confused thing to sort of then see these oversimplifications emerge is kind of weird. But, it's commonly stated that LT1 is 2 millimoles and LT2 is 4 millimoles. This is just simply not true. And I think this just comes down to people not being able to read graphs, which to me is like kind of concerning. But I think for a lot of us, right, if we're told it's 2 and we're told it's 4 and we feel that's coming from a sort of place of authority, we'll displace what we know about, graphical representations of data and just be like, okay, this is true. But there's nothing magical about the 2.0 number. And there's nothing magical about the 4.0 number. So 4.0 is being lactate threshold 2. Big reason why that's a falsehood is because lactate threshold 2 doesn't exist. The second thing that we want to consider here is what's an exponential function? So if you graph an exponential function, it has a certain shape to it, and you can go on Google Images and look that up. And that you're going to then look at the lactate threshold curve on Google Images, and you see that there's an initial period where the lactate threshold curve is flat, and then it grows. And I posted on Black Cats Run, our Instagram page, 8 examples of different lactate threshold step tests that I've done on the bike over the past few years, where you can see this, that it sort of goes along level and then it starts to go up. And that's real data, so you can see it doesn't necessarily always look like the ideal curve. But, in those instances, for me, it's not steady at 2.0. So we have to get rid of the 2.0 number because 2.0 is not the point of the onset of blood lactate accumulation, that OBLA. That's not where that's happening, okay? The other thing is, with the LT2, is that, like, looking at the curve and being like, oh, it starts to get even steeper here, that's another threshold. That means you don't understand math, because an exponential function, that's just what it looks like. That's actually the continuation of the relationship. That's not a change in the relationship. That's a continuation. The actual threshold is the point at which you shift from a linear relationship where lactate is constant, right? Within a reasonable variation is constant, okay, to an exponential function where after that point, we see exponential function occur. And so then to just sort of arbitrarily say, like, it looks pretty steep here, and then this must be enough, that's not a basis of anything. And I, as I said, I think people are forcing other ideas onto lactate threshold because, and if you go back to the market instance, this is a market threat, because what I'm suggesting is training isn't complicated. But what's complicated is learning how to train and, figuring out as the process goes along, what do I do next? What do I do next? But people act like, it's like, well, here's this thing and only I have the algorithm or the software that will calculate what you should do and how your fitness should improve. And again, go back to the biceps versus couch potatoes. For a lot of people getting into this stuff, it's like they maybe haven't really done anything before, and you can get a lot of false positives, basically. So one other problem to identify here by way of like introduction, and the fact that this introduction has taken a while, I think, shows one of two things. Either I talk too much, or that the scale and the complexity of this issue is actually really great. And I generally think that it's not that I talk too much, but that could be an example of confirmation bias. But I think that really it's the fact that we try to look for simplifications of things that are complicated that creates complexity. because you can't simplify things past a certain point and still be accurate. So one last problem, though, to consider here. People insist that threshold is a variety of different things in terms of measured performance. And all of these examples that I'm going to give, I believe, are incorrect. And I think they're also all used to point to this imaginary second lactate threshold. So people say that it's what you can do for 60 minutes. And, I used to try to apply this concept where that was my understanding at one point. And I've moved past that. I've taken in new information. I've recognized that this is not correct. And, I've shared, on the Instagram page, how just making that change, has led to significant improvement. I mean, my, running threshold by making this change has improved, by 30 seconds a mile, in the last 8 weeks or so. So, and I feel that that's a pretty reasonable to modest, improvement once you start doing this stuff correctly. People also say that it's X percentage of what you can do for an all-out 20-minute, effort on the bike. That's a pretty classic example in certain circles, especially FTP circles for road cyclists. We see that, this claim in running that it's like your 10K pace, which is super ridiculous, or that it's your half marathon pace, right? So let's say you're Eliud Kipchoge. Okay, so Eliud Kipchoge, right, can do 4:37 for a marathon. So what's his 10K, right, going to be? I don't know, 4:10? Is that going to be his threshold? Or if, not 4:10, certainly probably, 4:15, right? We're looking in the 26 range for 10,000 meters. And so then what's he supposed to, Eliud Kipchoge is supposed to do over-unders? So he's supposed to, what does that mean? He's supposed to, over-unders of, do, 3 minutes at 3:55 pace and then do, 2 minutes at 4:15 and just go back and forth like that. Like, that doesn't make any sense, but it's easy when we look at numbers that aren't the absolute, top level of performance to be like, well, I guess that's doable because, we see other people running 5-minute pace for, 10-mile road races, all the time. Right. So, for us, we could be like, okay, so if I'm going back and forth between 5:45 and 6:05, it's hard to recognize how absurd that is. But I think when you really think about it correctly, you start to realize that's insane. But also in running, people say it's like your half marathon pace. I think one of the reasons people hit the wall in the marathon so much is because they're going like at an effort that's like too high over threshold. You just like can't sustain that for that duration, right? I mean, you're not sustaining it for that duration because you're hitting the wall, right? But I'm saying that we can effectively tie that to, threshold explanation. And as you go further and further down the rabbit hole, I think what you begin to realize is there's a mudslide of misconceptions that are just constantly grinding their way through the landscape of training ideas. So from here, let's talk about a couple more focused concepts. So let's talk about what is the maximum lactate steady state. Then let's talk about the optimal way to increase lactate threshold. And let's talk about some arguments against LT2. And then let's give a couple comments to conclude on what effective training practices look like given this information. So when we talk about that first part, okay, maximum lactate steady state. So this is where we really, I think, want to talk about and go over some physiology. And I want to point out and acknowledge that you can pick up a lot of books about training that aren't going to say this. But if you got anything out of my 42-minute introduction here, it's that just because you pick up a piece of source material and it says something that isn't correct. And I'm going to try to explain to you why I believe this stuff to be true. And if you want to, engage in the conversation or the discussion, I'm, always happy to chat with people. And I welcome you to send me a message on the Instagram at Black Cats Run. And, I'm happy to, hash this out with people at greater length. So what physiology tells us, first of all, is that lactate is energy. So that's kind of our point of origin of understanding. Okay, so you need to recognize that it's an energy system. The second thing we want to understand is that the body tries to do things that are efficient, and this efficiency has been created as a consequence of natural selection that has been going on for billions of years. Okay, so there's been a lot of selective pressure to do this. So to look at these products and say, oh, of course, the body's just dumping toxic waste into itself, that just doesn't really hold weight in terms of what we know about evolutionary biology. Organisms that poison themselves are not going to be well suited to survive. So, lactate is energy. Now, basically, with the presence of oxygen, the body can convert that lactate into ATP and power the muscles. And as we'll see, so lactate is a vector or a vehicle to transport the energy that can be converted into that actionable energy that is ATP. And so Dr. George Brooks proved this, by way of his lactate shuttle hypothesis. And I've read in training books that I actually really like about training, but then you get to the chapter on physiology and it makes me want to tear my hair out, because they actually end up misleading people as to how to identify intensity. And it's just leave that out and talk about the stuff that you know. But so lactate shuttle hypothesis is actually this. It says that the reason why lactate is present in the blood and could be measured in the blood is because the bloodstream is the way that the energy, right, is turned into lactate in different parts of the body, and then it is shuttled through the bloodstream. So it's like taking the shuttle, right, to method of transportation. You are moving from point A to point B, and the body is using the bloodstream to do that. Hey, that's a really efficient, ingenious mechanism, almost like it's the product of several billion years of selective adaptation through evolution. Okay, so. And then, right, that can be taken out of the blood for whatever cells in the body need that energy. Okay? So when there's a work demand, the body responds to the work demand by producing lactate in proportion to that, and that lactate is made available in the blood. So whatever cells then specifically need that can use that. So the lactate is used. How is it used? The lactate is used by the mitochondria. So when people, this metabolism process that uses lactate and oxygen is called oxidative metabolism. And this is used in that process, mitochondria, right? Mitochondria, a lot of people learn in high school biology, is the powerhouse of the cell. That's something that they, route memorize, and they don't know what that means. But it's the powerhouse of the cell because it is the powerhouse, okay? It's like if lactate, okay, is a reservoir, then the mitochondria is the hydroelectric dam that the water drains through, right? So your ability to produce energy isn't based on the amount of water in the reservoir. It's the ton of water in the reservoir is actually based on the capacity of the dam, right? The capacity of the dam is what's determining that. And that's what the mitochondria does. So what the lactate meter is measuring is that basically if you are running the hydroelectric dam, right, you can run that up to a certain capacity. It can produce a certain amount of megawatts or whatever, right? And if we as a society had the capacity to do a rain dance and get it to rain more, and cause that water to, we need more water to be able to more potential energy, right? Because that's what the lactate in the blood is potential energy. It's not actually being used as energy until the mitochondria process it and, you get it into ATP. So it's coming down that dam, right? And if the dam is operating at max capacity, but there's still more water, then it's going to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, right? And that's what's happening is the water is sitting there, the lactate is sitting there in the bloodstream, ready to be used. But at a certain point, the lactate isn't being taken in anymore because you've reached the maximum capacity of the mitochondria to process that. But if you continue to apply a work demand, the body is just going to produce more lactate because it produces lactate in proportion to demand. It's clearly not producing lactate in proportion to mitochondrial capacity. So the only way that you're going to be able to increase intensity without increasing lactate accumulation is if you have enough mitochondria to process this. And if you look at my example graphs from my testing on myself, that's what you see as I go along for, at a certain wattage, then at a certain point, it starts to go up. And it's different in different times because I have different levels of fitness in those different tests. And it's actually better that my fitness is not always, perfectly proceeding in a linear progression, because you can see how from test to test it goes up and it goes down, because depending on the mitochondrial capacity, and that's going to vary that. Okay. So, and I would say really then calling it maximum lactate steady state is misleading. Now, I also want to say here that, there's semantics issues with this stuff, right? As people could say, well, no, maximum lactate steady states exists when you define it in this way, right? And, really good point that, Lachlan brought up to me. We were discussing the instance of when people say, well, look at this, here's some data of people going 30 minutes at 4 or 5 millimole or whatever. So that shows the presence of a maximum lactate steady state. And I would say, yes, that is a state at which the lactate is steady. Okay, right? And then the suggestion is, well, then if they try to do this power, it just starts to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. That's true, right? But that's how it's possible to work at a constant rate. Okay, so what we're trying to understand in training is what is the point of maximum stress? So all you're trying to do is create a signal to the body that says make more mitochondria. So how do you create a signal to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that you need a bigger hydroelectric dam? You start demanding more energy. You get to the peak capacity of the dam and say, look, we still want more electricity, right? Okay, so that's the signal. So continuing to demand more and more and then filling up the reservoir and trying to flood the dam and collapse the dam, that's not going to work. Okay, that's not effective. So what we want to be doing, okay, is we're just trying to get to the point of where are we getting that adaptive signal? Okay, yeah, to run a 10,000 in 27 minutes, whatever your example is, to run a 5K at close to 4-minute pace and 12:35, to do that, there has to be some period where it's steady. But this is not revelatory, right? This isn't evidence of a maximum lactate steady state. It's not maximal because steady state, because when you look at the test, a step test, no, you're now in the zone where if you increase that exertion at all, the lactate would start to increase. Okay. And, to say that, well, but if you go from 300 watts, you can be steady for 30 minutes and now at 315, the lactate continues to accumulate. That's the same thing as saying that, if you try to run a faster pace than you can hold for 10,000 meters, you can't do it. Yeah, that's going to happen. So I think that concept of maximum lactate steady state is just kind of bogus. That's a performance metric, right? And it has to be true that you can work at that level. And anytime you race, you're working at that level. Okay. But training at race pace is one of the worst practices that people can apply. People have been trying to, it's the original training concept. And it is the worst training concept. It is exercise in futility, basically, no pun intended. And we can talk more about, exercises in futility on some other episode. But, that concept of MLSS is wrong. So I'm using that term to say, I think the maximum lactate steady state should be the maximum velocity that you can reach while lactate is still steady. So if I'm going 200 watts, 220, 240, 260, and it's 0.8, 0.9, 0.1, 0.9, that's the steady state. And then at 280, if it goes up to 1.5, now I've exceeded that steady state. Okay, it's not about can I be steady at this level? Maximum lactate steady state should be defined as maximum mitochondrial capacity. So the vernacular is causing the problem, right? It's a semantics issue. Your lactate is steady when you are able to consume, utilize as much, and the lactate is not accumulating in the blood. Okay, because lactate production is increasing. Even when that lactate is steady in those first steps of the exercise test, your lactate production is actually increasing because your body needs more energy. Okay, so it's never a steady level of lactate. Lactate is always accumulating. What's steady, the only thing that's steady, in my opinion, is the utilization. Okay. It's steady that you can keep using it, right? And consuming it. And then it's no longer steady when you get over that point of accumulation. So for my brother, that's 0.7, and he gets all the way up to 320 watts and 20 watt steps from 180 to 320, 0.7 millimoles every single time. Okay. And then at 340, it goes up and it just continues to go up. Okay. But he has also done 435 watts for 55 minutes. And he, can regularly go out and time trial about an hour at about 400 watts. Okay. And he's, doing that at a effort that feels controlled, because the lactate isn't exponentially or geometrically stacking across that effort. Maybe towards the end, as he's really buckling down and trying to get that extra surge of energy, yeah. But there's going to be a period in which the lactate isn't accumulating, but he's not in steady state, I would argue, anymore. I mean, it's just, again, that's where it's semantics, right? If you want to say, well, it's steady across the 30 minutes or the time trial, then you can say that. Okay. But from a training perspective, that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in what is the point of intensity in which we create stress. And then once we're creating that stress, we say, if we go harder, are we getting anything else? The answer is no. Because once you put the pressure on the body to say, hey, you know what? This is an environment we're using basically all the mitochondria. The most efficient adaptive response the body has, and it's evolved to do this, is to say, okay, if we're regularly getting a signal to use, to do this, like we're in an environmental situation where it's ultimately more energy efficient to just produce more mitochondria. Like in a state of nature, not to sound like Thomas Hobbes, but in a state of nature, if you went out and you go full gas to, hunt something or to escape from a predator or a dangerous event, and you're just paralyzed the next day when you wake up because you went that, hard, you're going to die. You're not going to be able to move effectively. And if the threat is still there, you're screwed. So from it makes sense that the body is going to move towards a more efficient adaptation. When you have random, scarce, intermittent, hard exercise, the body is like, okay, whoa, that was crazy, but all right, now that's gone. You need a constant pressure. And when you train with the correct concept of maximum lactate steady state as a maximum mitochondrial capacity, you can do that. And so and I guess we also acknowledge at this point that semantically, people will probably, and some people will probably just insist, but, Tristan, that's not what maximum lactate steady state is. Maximum lactate steady state is this. And if that's kind of where you're at, I guess we're at an agree to disagree point, because that's where we're not really seeing the forest for the trees. And I think that's an example of kind of that, method bias of like, well, high intensity VO2 max, that's how it should be. That's how I want it to be. And we're just forcing that instead of recognizing what I believe the data and the research and also the historical evidence of training practice is really supporting. So key here then, right, is recognizing that lactate is accumulating, right? And I'm restating, I realize some of these things, but I think restating it helps to better progress the point. The lactate's accumulating because the body produces and makes lactate available in the blood based on the level of work we're demanding. And lactate production at the point of origin is proportional to work demand. It's not based on how much lactate we have the capacity to metabolize. We produce energy, the lactate, and make it available as energy. It's kind of like how you can be a really great runner and a really mediocre cyclist, right? So if you haven't done the minimal amount of exercise for your muscles and your nervous system and whatnot, and your central governor to be accepting of that level of exercise, then if you switch and you take a 12, 30, 5,000 meter runner and you put them in the Tour de France, they're going to get destroyed, right? Even though they have an incredible capacity to do aerobic exercise. But I believe that you could find a minimum amount of cycling and then for that runner, and then put that, and then predominantly do running training, put them in a race, and provided they had the skills to do a road bike race, they'd be able to do well, and vice versa. If you took, you see Tom Dumoulin, run some 10Ks, and is not a big runner, but is running 10K times, has run 10K times that most only runners would be very pleased with. And everything he's done has been on the bike, right? And then if you get enough running that your body's familiar with that, you can you can cross that over, right? And that's because these mechanisms. So another question with this stuff: why does exercise start to get harder at the point of what I am defining as maximum lactate steady state, and what I am then going further, right, and saying let's call it maximum mitochondrial capacity, or MMC? Well, at that point, right, so all metabolic systems are working at the same time. We don't switch from one to another as velocity and exertion increase. That's a myth. So you are getting, but you can sort of say, well, we're getting X kilojoules from these different metabolic capacities, pathways. So like in oxidative metabolism, mitochondria using O2 and lactate and et cetera to create ATP, right? And you're getting X kilojoules from that. So, you might be getting 70 kilojoules, right? And that's might be when you're using all the mitochondria, right? You can only get 70 kilojoules, right? Like the hydroelectric dam, there's a limitation. And then, but you have the capacity to go harder. And we're evolved from, anaerobic organisms, right? So it makes sense that we can do this. All life, right, began with anaerobic organisms, billions of years ago. So we still have that in our pathway, but we're just more oxidative because it's just more efficient, right? So more efficient, more likely to survive. That's a trait that becomes dominant, is selected for. Evolutionary biology again. And, when you look at this stuff, you realize that, okay, the body doesn't like turn off the 70 kilojoules it's getting from oxidative capacity, oxidative metabolism, oxidative capacity, and then switch. It's just like, okay, that can't do that. So then these other systems have to basically compensate in a sense, right? So now to get all additional kilojoules can only come from these, now a limited number of alternative systems, right? Like turning on solar panels on a cloudy day, not necessarily going to get as much out of that as you are going to get out of the massive hydroelectric dam. So that's kind of, where we see that start to shift. And, from the body's perspective, from a central governor theory perspective, the body's like, whoa, okay, we're at the limit of this efficient system. Do we really need to do this? And so it starts sending out these stress signals. And, that's sort of what the central governor theory suggests, is that the body starts pacing itself more and more aggressively. And the way it does that is by creating distress. And what training obviously shows is that if you improve fitness, something that might be impossible, people who once never could run a mile in 5 minutes, ultimately some of those people get to the point where they can run a marathon at under 5-minute pace, which I think is a great, simple, illustrative example of this. Okay, but there's always a point at which you're going to eclipse the capacity of that oxidative system. And when you do that, you get into a state of distress. So the steady state that people have, and again, my example graphs, I think, reflect this. Even just for myself, there's individual variance, but it can look different for different people. But basically, if you start easily enough and you gradually increase the intensity, for a while, you'll just continue to produce the same millimole reading, plus or minus 0.1 or 0.2 millimole. But at some point, it'll go up by half a millimole to 1 millimole. And at that point, if you increase intensity, it won't jump back down. It will probably go up by another half to 1 millimole. And then as you increase it, right now we're at the point of exponential function. Okay. And that's the tipping point for me. That's the point in which you've exceeded maximum lactate steady state. Right. Maybe people feel that I'm bum rushing and stealing their terminology. If that's how you feel, let's say, hey, that's the point. You've exceeded maximum mitochondrial capacity. We aren't trying to train to stimulate lactate. We don't have a problem producing lactate. The body produces lactate. Okay. That's not the issue. We're trying to use our energy. So we're trying to get to the point where we stimulate the mitochondria. So my youngest brother, for example, and he's done a 67-minute half marathon, right? His is 0.7, right? Mine is around 1, 0.9 to 1. Other people that I've tested, it's been, 1.3, 1.5. I've tested one person who it is close to 2, but it's different, right? So for different people. And so you can't really know this unless you're looking at that data. So what's the optimal way? Second part here. What's the optimal way to increase lactate threshold? To get the most improvement in lactate threshold, it's, I think, important to recognize that you do not pull this up, you push it up, right? So, and I would say that like the only thing we should really care about, and this is why I say training activities that are done over lactate threshold, which should be very minimal, also just basically shouldn't even really be considered like exactly training or a different training zone, because really the only thing that ultimately makes you better as an endurance athlete is to like improve lactate threshold, because that's how we get better overall. So, and lactate threshold is like, how fast can I go while still just maintaining the exact same level of blood lactate accumulation I had when I was running 10-minute pace or when I was doing, 100 watts. So the way we do this is by subjecting the body to a stress environment where it essentially perceives there are constant pressure on its mitochondrial level. Okay. And if we do that, we'll see improvement. And the biggest problem that I see that people have who are sort of maybe getting close to doing this the right way is that it's just so easy to drift over threshold and into higher intensities that people they just can't help themselves. And they end up doing a couple impressive sessions but then they're absolutely dead and they can't do much more beyond just like struggling and feeling sluggish and feeling absolutely dead. And I've done this myself. And, if you think that's how it is, you tend to accept this stuff. And, my favorite example, because I think that the historical perspective is a huge deficit in how we think about this stuff. And part of the deficit in historical perspective is people just say, well, the older it is, the more likely it is to be like wrong and outdated. And I don't agree with that. So the Arthur Lydiard, New Zealand runner and endurance coach, pretty much reached the conclusion that getting as much time as possible at what he called the maximum aerobic steady state, which, I would call my thing is maximum mitochondrial capacity, or what I say, this is really the only thing that matters when we think about maximum lactate steady state. So for Lydiard, he only counted miles run in that zone. He said subjectively that could be 70% to 100% of that maximum aerobic steady state. Now, if you have a power meter, you don't really want to count down 30% off from your lactate threshold, but he's saying in terms of how it felt, right? I was more descriptive. It wasn't an actual, because they weren't running around with power meters and stride pods and stuff like that. So, and that's where the 100-mile training week comes from. It came from Lydiard, and for him, that was about how many miles they did in that aerobic zone. So, for guys at that level, running, low 13s for 5,000 meters, 354 per mile, whatever. Let's say that their, maximum aerobic steady state is, say, I don't know, like 5:30 pace, 6-minute pace. And, maybe that's too conservative, but like if we use the conservative number, that means that 100 miles a week is 600 minutes a week of steady state, of, maximum mitochondrial capacity of lactate threshold. And, that's like comes out to whatever, like maybe 70 to 90 minutes a day. And they also did, a number of miles a week in the aerobic zone, which can be up to, but also somewhat below the maximum mitochondrial capacity, below lactate threshold. Let's just call it lactate threshold going forward, the rest of the episode, keep it clear. Lactate threshold. And they would do another 20 to 50 miles a week like that. But he didn't say they ran 120 or 150 miles a week. He emphasized 100 miles a week because he's saying, like, look, this is effective because of the significant dosing of lactate threshold zone training. Okay. And, that goes back to the concept of that when you give your body, you want constant pressure and exposure to this demand. That's what causes the epigenetic response. And, basically Lydiard said that, like, if you train really hard, like, you can't get better. Okay. It doesn't really work. But by training easy, okay, it gets better. And what's hard about it is like setting aside the time. It's, getting yourself to do it when it's not enjoyable because of the weather, because of, competing interests that you have, etc. But the actual physical exercise isn't really that hard. It's cumulatively hard. But when you stay under lactate threshold, you don't generate muscular fatigue, and you can do work in that state pretty much every day. And that's the other key to Lydiard's epiphany, is that You can do this all the time. And I would say a modern example is what the Norwegians are doing now. Like that's basically, they're doing the exact same thing. They're just using different vernacular. They're using lactate meters, and they're doing it more so as intervals. And I think one of the aspects of intervals is like sometimes that's a way to sort of, make sure you're not going too hard, right? And I think that's the only value of intervals, is to not go too hard. If you want to go hard, don't do intervals. Just like go as hard as you can until you're dead. And good luck with that. So in essence, I think that's really strategically, conceptually, how you improve, how you optimize that, is you optimize it by spending as much time as possible doing it. And then you have to either be really self-aware, or you work with, some friend or a coach to try to like reflect on what you're doing and try to figure out, okay, am I getting fatigued? Am I, because if you start to get fatigued, you're actually going to be limited. And, as my dad said, even if you're running a great 1500, basically the first 1200 meters needs to feel pretty easy. And I think that's a lot of people don't understand that. They think the key to running well or doing well in endurance events is to murder yourself. So how about argument against LT2 then? So Olav Alexander Boo, the coach of the Norwegians, Christian Gustav, has come out and said that there's no evidence for the existence of a second lactate threshold. There's no physiological evidence for that. So, if my voice and my examples aren't good enough and you want an authority figure, I think Olav currently has authority figure status in endurance sports. And so he's saying it doesn't exist. And then you look, so here's somebody saying that's not a thing. And then you look at, the results that some of his athletes are getting. And I think this is ironically further supported by the fact that Gustav and Christian really have been kind of unremarkable this year. And I'm not saying that from the perspective of like, I feel that I'm what they're doing, even when they're unremarkable, it's still to me remarkable. But for them, right, relative to what you would think they'd be able to do, they're sort of struggling. And I don't know this for a fact because I'm not party to this information, but I would speculate, and I think it's a grounded speculation to say that they probably switched to trying to train closer to imaginary LT2 or do VO2 max intensity because they're thinking about the Paris Olympics and they think, well, that's what you need to do shorter races. And I think they should have just kept doing what they had been doing. And I think you do that, you do a couple races, and then you're good. Whatever quote unquote anaerobic intensity you need, you get from races. Even if you're a middle distance track runner, you're an athlete in any sport focusing on races that are maybe 3 minutes, 13 minutes long, like you still need very, very little anaerobic intensity. I'd recommend everybody check out the book, Easy Interval Training. It's probably one of my two favorite training books. I think the physiology section, I think, is off. And maybe I'll do an episode where I talk about that. But I think if you set that stuff aside and you just really pay attention to what the author himself is actually saying, Klaus Luck is saying you should be doing, I think it's like, holy crap, right? This guy gets it. And when you look at that in conjunction with Arthur Lydiard's book, Running with Lydiard, or some of his other books, I think you really start to see this picture being pushed together. So that's the other interesting thing too, right? Is that the lactate threshold, evidence is actually really now validating these people who are like, nope, you're training too hard. You need to be aerobic, and it's actually feels pretty easy. And training is not about purifying your soul. So, right. So never mind though, for these, Christian and Gustav, never mind if you're talking about doing 60-minute or longer triathlon races, right? That's would be even less of a logical demand to do this high intensity. But, I also understand that, I think Christian is sort of traditionally been the better, shorter distance runner. He's the guy who won the Olympics and in Tokyo. And, then you have this sort of sense of like, well, he likes to go harder. And I get that, like, for some people it's very cognitively and neurochemically rewarding, but you wonder kind of what's driving this stuff. So anyway, there's just nothing happening at that point physiologically, and Alexander Boo says that, and I've tried to, I think, introduce this a little bit, but the only change is that you go from using lactate to exceeding your from using the lactate to exceeding your mitochondrial capacity to utilize it, and then it accumulates. That's the only thing that you see on that graph, right? And looking at it and being like, oh, it's an exponential function, but it gets really steep there. That's like a grade school math question of like, oh, and then the whole point is to like explain, actually this is an exponential function. So even though it's not a constant slope, it's actually a constant relationship. So it's not like there's anything going on there mathematically, in my opinion. That's just kind of how exponential functions look. And, I think that's important to recognize, like there's sort of some just sort of like visual illusion bias. And I get though that people are saying, yeah, but for 30 minutes you can do blank, and, but then look how high up that is on this curve. Yeah, but like all that is, so what you're telling me is that like people can run a steady tempo for 10,000 meters, and like you're like just learned that. Like people have been doing that back to Pavo Nurmi, and before people have been pacing evenly. Like that's okay, and you just suddenly realize that people can go run steady, because like by that same token, you could just say, well, if that's the steady pace, that's the steady pace. And I think that's where people are just like going off the deep end, and they're not even thinking about what the lactate actually means. Lactate is energy. What's the point in which we have a tipping point? Like there's nothing happening at that LT2 level, like that hasn't already happened. The only change is you increase intensity, and you can consume and take advantage of the increasing lactate production. And then you get to the point where you don't have enough mitochondria. And so the lactate production increases as it has been increasing all along, and then it starts to accumulate. Okay. But then if you like level off that, training intensity increase, yes, for some length of time, you're going to putter along, you're going to hum along, and then you're going to hit the wall. Okay. But that's not a threshold. Okay. Because like that is when the threshold is derived from the concept of what's happening physiologically, energetically with the system. Okay. You're not seeing anything at that LT2 point. From a training culture perspective, right, we said that people just are trying to force high intensity training, and they're trying to, and that's what they're doing, is they're trying to say, well, how can I use lactate to measure my higher intensity, my VO2 max stuff? How can this metabolite tell me about that? And really what the metabolite is telling you is that your high intensity stuff is bogus. And the most effective athletes have always been athletes who've really figured out how to get good aerobic training, right? And sometimes that has been using faster intervals, but then the recovery is important, right? Because actually the recovery really determines whether or not that's effective. So, but think about this. People used to think cigarettes would treat asthma, right? So people are capable of believing anything. LT2, I think, is also not validated from an outcomes perspective, right? So that'd be another kind of, way to look at this. If there was a real truth to the LT2 thing, then it would be significant and easily identifiable, significant and easily identified improvements that would present themselves from working at that kind of intensity. But there's really no evidence in practice that doing that. And my experience as a coach, coaching cross country and coaching other people, bears this out. And I think people can convince themselves that it's true. And I know that a lot of elite athletes like to claim they did this special workout or that special workout. And I think people can be national champions and they can be Olympians and not necessarily understand training at all. Like for some people, training just kind of falls into place. And those people are the exception, and not the exception because, the training works for them because they're superior. They're the exception because they came into these situations where the paces that they were being assigned by their coaches just weren't too hard. They might have been over their lactate threshold, but they weren't so far over their lactate threshold that they couldn't improve. And so for them, it just always kind of worked. And they never have to solve the puzzle of their success. And so they just say, well, this is what I did. And because they say when they did it, I was the best. But you'll notice how, for example, performances keep improving over time. So that means that elite athletes have not unlocked all the truth. And I think what happens is that when you have people who move to training aerobically, you see this. And I think there's some experimentation, with, variability, but, when you're looking at it in aggregate, that's what you see. My dad used to train with Joni Benoit in the early 80s. in Maine. And when he ran with her, he describes that they would just out the door immediately, 5:30 pace, and just do that for 20 miles, right? Which is a little under a 2-hour run. And, Joni's certainly one of the best marathoners to ever do it. I think that's, pretty objective. But it's not, there wasn't, he doesn't talk about, doing crazy workouts, right? He's talking about going out, being, aerobically, doing aerobic work, right? And focusing on that and accumulating that. A great case study about elite Nordic skier, can't remember her name, but it's frontiersin.org. If you just look up elite case Nordic skier case study, the skier, in order to get better, she had to decrease her training done around this supposed LT2 by, it looks like, about half, and actually increase total amount of training time and increase training done below lactate threshold, increased that from 85% to 93% of her training. And then she had this 5-year period where she was just totally dominant, which is, a long time in the scale of being at the absolute elite end of sports, right? But if you play that out to I want to be a good athlete for myself, well, then you're talking about just being awesome for decades, right? Personally, right? Maybe you can't always be, the absolute best of the world best, because, youth, unfortunately for all of us, plays a role in performance. But I think the fact that, this is what I'm saying when it's not validated from an outcomes perspective. If LT2 was a thing and it was important, then cutting the LT2 and doing more easier training would have caused the athlete to do worse, but it was the exact opposite effect. I think that's, really, really significant. So all this leads me to believe it's a myth. But even if LT2 was a real threshold, the reality is it's just so inefficient to train at that intensity. It's sure, you're also telling the body you don't have enough mitochondria, but you can do that for maybe 40 minutes a week, right? Whereas Lydia is saying is, well, actually, we found that you can do it for 500 to 600 minutes a week. That's a totally different level of thing. And we also know from the way the body adapts that it adapts to consistent. You want to get acclimated to the heat, you just needs to be hot all the time. Okay. If, right, if you go out, if you have air conditioning and you're that's hot, and you go outside for 5 minutes, and then you come back inside for a minute, and you go back outside for minutes, and you do that 5 times, and you do that once a week and spend the rest of the week in air conditioning, you're not going to get acclimated to the heat. The epigenetics of the body doesn't respond to that body. It's just what was that? Right? It's just this thing, going by in the corner of your vision. It's just it's irrelevant. But you just can't hold the intensity of LT2 for nearly a long, per rep, per workout, per week. So it's just not you can't get as much signaling power to the body, enough pressure to make the response to increase that lactate threshold by increasing the mitochondrial capacity. And it just creates so much muscular fatigue that the rest of the training time just becomes ineffectual. I believe in training a lot. I don't really think junk miles is true. I think junk miles occur as a product of training hard. VO2 training creates junk miles. People say you should do VO2 training because junk miles is a waste of your time. Junk mileage occurs in high intensity training. It occurs in VO2 max training protocols. That's what creates junk miles, because the fatigue is too high, and then the rest of the training is useless. So that if they do the other training, all it does is they're just going out and their legs are tired. And so when you're really that tired, any amount of additional work is just going to increase fatigue, right? So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? But the reason why high volume only works is when you're doing LT1 is because that's the point in which you're getting that stimulus. There's no magic happening. Okay. Nothing is happening there. There's no evidence for LT2. I believe it is a myth. Okay. Last part. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. I hope that this is as interesting and engaging to you as it is to me. But effective training practices. So once you know the intensity needs to be below lactate threshold, and it's a waste of time to be training at LT2, and LT2 is a myth, then the question becomes, the issue is, how do you design training? And I think here it's important to recognize that you don't train the body to tolerate lactate or clear it or whatever else, right? You produce lactate, that's good. So the right training makes you faster. So for example, stuff like over-under is a waste of time, right? So we really recognize now that there's no benefit to fitness of training over that intensity. Okay, and that's why Lydiard said you do the, high volume of, aerobic training period. He says that do that as long as possible. And it's the other phases of training, that sort of work on kind of specific things that are not about lactate threshold, but, they help, and that's a different issue. But if you want to get fast, you're really focusing on the aerobic training. Okay. So here I say, how do you do that? Well, I think you want a combination. You can use some continuous, steady paced sessions. But I think actually it's more effective to design a pattern of short and long intervals with short and long recoveries and, vary what that looks like in which you're working in that threshold zone, kind of like how Lydiard describes that as the subjective 100%, but can be down to subjectively 70% of lactate threshold. I think that's really important. And it's not to say that you're going to a track and you're walking or you're standing around. It's like you're going out and you're doing a loop. You say, okay, here I'm going to be a little bit stronger towards the lactate threshold, and then I'm going to back off, right? You're just sort of varying it, right? The benefits of that is it's more enjoyable. It allows you to sort of be able to practice going a little faster without just sort of like, okay, I've now initiated this pace. I must do this the whole way. That's not necessary. Because the reality is even doing like, if you go out and you do an hour and a half, especially for runners, you do a 2-hour run, in that lactate steady state zone, you're going to usually feel great. And then you're tired, so we're managing fatigue is an important part of training, because if you're too fatigued, it's hard to keep doing this stuff. So also thinking about like how much volume per week, like that's the point of stimulus, right? It's not how fast is the 5x1 mile session, how good is your 2x20 minutes. It's about like aggregate volume. That's the point at which you see this improvement. And I think, from here the work becomes individual, and it has to be responsive to how the individual is feeling, what allows the individual to, improve, what is, the right kind of stylistic approach to doing this stuff. And some of that has to do with like what's more enjoyable, what's more motivating. And then you have to evaluate, individually and see what's responsive. Okay. And I think if you do that, I think you're going to get better. But if for people who are feeling like they're not improving, but they put in a lot of time, or they feel like feel like they're going in different directions at the same time, I think that the problem is overall aggregate intensity needs to change. And I think really what this ultimately implies is that there's really like only one training zone, right? And that you're just trying to figure out how to get as much time in that zone as possible. And that the other kinds of things we might try to do to improve performance in competition need to usually be done significantly less. And it would be more beneficial to think about them in different ways. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this enjoyable, thought-provoking, engaging. Maybe this has challenged some preconceived notions that you've had. I'm happy to engage with people who are interested in knowing more, have specific questions. If enough other interesting questions come up, we can use that as the basis of another podcast episode. Otherwise, you can look for part 2 of Who's on First coming up sometime in the next few weeks. And we'll catch you next time.